Okay, great. Sorry. Good morning, everyone. I'm Gregory Cornfield, Associate Editor and LA Correspondent at Commercial Observer. Thank you all for joining us for today's Life Science Forum to discuss one of the most important industries to kickstart economic activity. It's the most important industry to spark new real estate deals and establish the US as a global leader in innovation. Over the past 2 years, the life sciences community has committed to battling the COVID-19 pandemic and has succeeded in more ways than one. Not only have the pharmaceutical companies delivered on their promise for vaccines at the start of the year, but the growing demand of greater laboratory and research and development spaces has made the life sciences one of the hottest markets for real estate executives looking to diversify their portfolios, and has cities nationwide with new economic and job opportunities. So one thing is clear, 2021 was the year for life sciences. We have an excellent program planned today, welcoming experts from both coasts to discuss where they're seeing new opportunities for growth, how leading cities are making more room for rapid market growth, why the life sciences industry has been a critical investment, safe haven for the US, and how diversifying real estate portfolios with high growth industries is strengthening portfolios and communities across the country. But before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's program sponsors, our presenting sponsors, CBRE, Enid, Ewing Cole, LK Partners Incorporated, and New Grange Construction, Marks Paneth, and SGA. I would also like to thank our associate partner, New York City Builds BioPlus. A couple quick house cleaning items before we get started. If you have any questions for the panelists, you can submit them via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The moderators will address as many questions as possible. Lastly, if you're looking to connect with today's speakers, definitely let us know. You'll receive a live poll at the conclusion of each panel asking if you'd like to connect with today's speakers. And we'll be sure to pass along your contact information along to all the speakers that you select. So now we can move to our opening panel, which is great. It's now my pleasure to introduce our opening panel to deliver a life sciences market report. Today, our moderator, Edward, partner real estate group for Marks Paneth LLP, Sharma, for the partner at IndieBio, Brooke Slocum, Studio Director at SGA, Matthew Weir, Executive Vice President at Tonic Partners, and that should do it. Take it away.
Thank you, Gregory. As Gregory mentioned, my name is Edward Suleimanov. I'm a partner and in the real estate group at Marks Paneth. Marks Paneth is a premier accounting, tax, and advisory firm. With a team of nearly 700 professionals, we provide a full range of audit, accounting, tax, and consulting services. I mainly advise commercial and residential real estate owners, developers, and investors, as well as real estate management firms on all facets of accounting and taxation. So today's topic, obviously, is the life science market report. The global life science industry has been on the rise, growing more rapidly than ever over the past decade. In recent years, we have seen an intensified investment, both public and private, in engineering a full ecosystem for the life sciences to flourish. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic changed the demand for real estate, specifically here in New York and in other places, and increased the demand for cutting-edge medical research, which further identified the need for life science as a sub-industry in the real estate market. This momentum has opened a world of opportunities for real estate investors to enter the market or to reinvent their existing facilities for housing the medical, pharmaceutical, and other research-oriented sciences. Entering this market may prove to be challenging in many aspects, but there are multiple financial incentives and potential tax advantages as well. Today, I'm honored to be hosting such a distinguished panel of experts to discuss the life science market. Okay, so I guess first off, I will ask our panelists to give a quick introduction about themselves and their background and expertise. Parikshit Sharma, we'll start with you.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Parikshit, and I'm a partner at IndieBio. And IndieBio is the flagship life science arm of SOSV, an early stage venture capital firm. We have lab spaces in San Francisco and New York, and we pioneered the model of early stage deep tech investing by providing dedicated lab space to an emerging wave of life science startups. I have a computational and financial background, and I started my career with the firm 4.5 years ago now. Happy to be here.
Matthew?
Good morning, everyone. Matthew Weir, Taconic Partners. We're a New York City-based developer. We currently have two projects under development here in New York City on the west side of Manhattan. All total, it's about 600,000 square feet of lab development and almost $1 billion of investment into the sector. We also invest in other sort of industries here in New York City, and part of our thesis for New York is, that it's a location that talent wants to be. And as Ed pointed out, and obviously the topic for today is one area that we're really seeing now is a push for life science, even pre-pandemic, but certainly significant momentum now. And in addition to the two active projects, we have a pipeline of future development. So it's a sector we're very much committed to here in the city.
Brooks?
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Brooke Slocum from SGA. SGA is a Boston and New York based architecture firm in our 30th year. We have projects up and down the Northeast Corridor, and our New York office has got projects currently in Jersey, down in Philadelphia, up in Connecticut and New Hampshire, as well as here in the city in Long Island and downtown. We're finding we probably have about 6 million square feet on the boards right now. And as I think you identified earlier, Edward, this is a market that's growing so rapidly in the core markets as well as our more emerging markets. And it's very exciting to be part of that process.
Okay, so I guess my first question would be for Parikshit. According to a recent report, a record $70 billion of private and public capital has put into the life science related companies in North America in 2020. However, the question I still get from a lot of people who are not familiar with life science is, what is life science anyways? What are the companies that invest in it? Who are the people that are employed in this industry? So can you give us a little background on what IndieBio kind of does in their role to help them flourish?
Sure. And maybe I'll start with life sciences as the field in itself. It's an incredibly dynamic and evolving field. And modern day life science, I guess, as we know it, started in 1860s when proteins were discovered, and quickly in 1890s when DNA was discovered. And we are on a quest to discover, research, and design life. And that is rationally designing and understanding the building blocks of life, and how life science has been known in a commercial setting for a really, really long time is in the field of human health. So may it be medical devices like the ventilators in our hospitals, but also diagnostics like the COVID test we did, but also other ways of treating disease. And also now with our understanding of life in itself, we can even cure some diseases by going to the root of the genome and tackling those diseases. So those are areas of human health, and I think the field over the past couple of decades has matured incredibly and become very interdisciplinary, where we've started seeing crossover from machine learning, computation, bioinformatics, which are tools now that we have made commercially viable. And as a result, we have a wave of digital therapeutics and AI-based drug design. So there's a lot of new things that are happening in this field. And our firm, IndieBio, when it started, we were one of the first providers of Biosafety 1 and Biosafety 2 labs in San Francisco, right in downtown San Francisco, and a co-working space for startups. And the founders of IndieBio saw that there was more and more talent in universities, more and more patents, and the Human Genome Project had made it cheaper and faster to sequence the genome. The genome is, our ability to understand the genome is accelerating faster than our ability to store more data on chips, right? So it's accelerating Moore's law. And just in 2000, it costs millions of dollars to sequence the genome. And today, all of us can go on 23andMe or Ancestry and get a kit for $89.99, and I guess $69.99 with a discount, right? And we saw that the one bottleneck that kept that talent from creating startups was a lab. So unlike other fields where it takes a computer and Amazon Web Services to launch a big startup, in life sciences, you really need sophisticated labs, and the upfront cost of setting up a lab can go to, a simple lab can go as high as 1.5 to $2 million. So our investors, our parent fund, endowed us with a lab, and at that time that was a very very big investment for a venture capitalist to be plunking money into capital expenditure. And that lab brought scientists from all over the world to start marking their science to market and translating their research on life and designing life rationally into building commercial products. So our firm, in addition to this human health side that I just talked about and the crossover, we quickly saw that life sciences was way more than that. There was a movement that was started at IndieBio, which was the future of food, where scientists were designing food and the protein we eat bottom up and growing cells in the lab without slaughter, because the current animal slaughter system and meat market that we have to cater to our protein demand is very unsustainable. And that gave birth to what we call planetary health. So our firm is also investing heavily in life sciences as it pertains to making the planet healthy by making healthier proteins for food, but also proteins show up in so many commercial and industrial applications. And our bet is that biology is greener, more efficient, and less petrochemically reliant than chemicals and petrochemicals. So stuff like glue, wood, the denim, the indigo that goes in our denim, and even fabric and silks, we can now design with biology the way we used to do with petrochemicals as the building block. So that's the wide scope of what the fund invests in, and that's how we define life sciences. And we still have our lab, and thanks to this burgeoning sector, the state of New York saw our work, and New York was an underfunded sector for life sciences. So we have a lab space now in New York City as well. And the pandemic brought so many other startups from all over the world to us. And we learned that there's a lot of other lab spaces for life sciences all over the world. So I'll stop there, but that's the segue to how it's distributed and shaping up for us.
That was very helpful. So like, speaking of New York, right? Historically, New York has had a difficult time attracting life science tenants. We're a little behind with our zoning laws that only allowed the lab space to be in certain manufacturing districts. Obviously, that kind of changed in 2016. And now New York also made, $500 million investment into the life science industry back in 2016. And I think Mayor de Blasio committed to another one in June of this year. So my next question would be for Matt. Matt, New York City is quickly growing to compete with other national life science hubs. Why is the New York City market so appealing right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, most people view New York, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, as a hub for talent. Traditionally, New York has been the hub for finance, media, recently tech. And I think, as you said, it's been slower to build its life science footprint for a number of reasons. You mentioned zoning, but there's been and remains to be high barriers to entry for building labs in New York. As we see now significant supply, you've seen more activity, more venture capital coming into New York to fund its companies. And obviously, I should back up. It's always had the sort of fundamentals that really drive life science demand. We have amazing academic medical institutions. New York City is the second highest recipient of NIH funding. The New York metro area has the largest life science workforce in the country. I think we could probably go on and on. There's significant fundamentals that drive life science markets. We've seen other markets take off. Boston is sort of the one that everyone looks to. New York has many of the same fundamentals. We're now starting to deliver some of the other ingredients that will allow New York to flourish, like lab space, as I mentioned, more active venture capital community. So Taconic's at the forefront, obviously, of the real estate side, but it's not just real estate. It's not just creating labs, it's about creating the ecosystem. And I think that's really starting to take hold. And as I sort of said before, we saw, as a developer who was delivering labs to the market, momentum pre-COVID. Everyone is talking about it now. You've seen the momentum really kick up several notches globally, and certainly in these hub markets. And right now we have a front row seat to see it really taking hold in New York. All of the elements are now in place. And that means, the sort of incubator community, obviously IndieBio is a new addition to that, super exciting for the local ecosystem. And obviously lab space, the talent is here, the leadership is here, the venture capital is here. So we're really excited about kind of where New York will take off now to become, as you said, a leading hub nationwide.
So I guess just a follow-up question to that. So we have a limited supply of lab space in New York. Can you discuss how Taconic is currently meeting the high demand for the lab space here in New York?
Sure. So we currently, as I mentioned earlier, have two projects under development. The Hudson Research Center is one on the west side of Manhattan. We're building that in partnership with Silverstein. And then just 10 blocks north of that, 125 West End, in partnership with Nuveen and LaSalle. So all told, that's 600,000 square feet of lab. The sort of built environment today, built supply is around 2 million square feet. So just, us alone, increasing that pipeline significantly. And obviously there's many others. You're starting to see hubs pop up. Obviously the East Side has been sort of the biggest established hub for many years now. Midtown South, Hudson Square, Long Island City, et cetera. So, there's continues to be high barriers to development. We would tell you that New York City has always had that. Life science presents some new challenges, and Brooks and team can talk about zoning and sort of some of the physical. But both of our projects are former industrial buildings. Those tend to be repositioned very well. These are significant infrastructure upgrades. These spaces are very robust, significant amounts of air, which means significant amounts of heating and cooling, fume hood exhaust, acid neutralization tanks, et cetera. Significant investment. And, we're meeting the challenge by finding buildings that are suited for this. And that's sort of the real estate side. We can talk, I think, collectively as a panel about also building up the ecosystem, the community that is important to help fill those spaces, but then also build sort of New York up as a global hub for the sector.
Brooke, so this, I guess, leads me to my question to you. When I first started reading about life sciences, I was thinking about the fact, this was during obviously the height of COVID, all these traditional office spaces are empty. And, in my mind, without reading too much, I was thinking, we'll just take our average office building and turn it into a life science building. We'll fill all the space up in New York with these life science tenants, right? Obviously not the case. It's not that simple. In most cases, it can't be done. So if you could just, discuss with us some of the obstacles of building and designing a life science building, as well as, potentially converting a pre-existing office building into a life science.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think a lot of people have thought about that. And I know that I'm sure the other, Matt's also had it, and some of your panelists after us have had a chance to look at the idea during this COVID, where every landlord in the city was trying to figure out what to do with these commercial real estate projects, whether it's to be built or something that's already existing. Every building has a unique characteristic, both from a zoning perspective, whether it's allowable currently, and some of its physical characteristics in order to become a life science facility. We have checklists that we work with just to kind of check off the box. We in Boston have a different scenario where everything has got an opportunity to become life sciences because we're basically dealing with a supply need up there. And we're able to convert even the worst building that we would imagine over to a life science facility. It doesn't become it's not as incredibly flexible, but it's doable because the demand is so high. In New York, we looked at all the buildings, especially during COVID, when you first started thinking about it. We looked at a lot of buildings, and there's a lot of infrastructure that has to go into these buildings. And some buildings come pretty well preserved with great loading, that they can handle it. They've got great infrastructure that was brought into them. Those can become good candidates, like the Hudson Research Center that Matt's been working on. I think there are challenges, obviously, and there's cost implications. You can tack on to a life science facility up to 30 to 40% more just to get your building ready. So the core and shell cost can be pretty extreme if you want to have a life science ready building. And that doesn't always play out if you don't have the demand. I think some of the conversations that we were talking about earlier, you need to have the right amount of people in the right place to allow that market to take off for the right amount of money. And every building that we're looking at up and down the East Coast, you want to make sure that you're going to be able to have talent and the tenants that can stay in those buildings, or else the landlord or the building owner has put too much money into something that they can never recoup. So we do a lot of that early analysis to make sure the buildings can be converted properly and economically viable. The life science market has a discovery pipeline kind of scenario. Cities like San Francisco and Boston are fully embedded into the life science pipeline, which includes CGMP facilities, corporate headquarters, manufacturing, all that stuff. In cities like New York, where we're very in an early phase, we're basically dealing with the early computational biology, the basic research, vivarium, pilot plants, potentially. So we're in an earlier stage in regards to the discovery pipeline, and there isn't as much demand, even though, as Matt said, we have a lot of incredible talent from Jersey all the way at Long Island and up into Connecticut. So we have a lot of the right building blocks. It's just that for a long time, New York real estate was too expensive, and you needed to be in a taller building in order to make your return. I think we are seeing a change in that, and it's becoming kind of exciting finding the right piece that will make New York an attractive area. But I think that the most important thing is when we start seeing enough real estate, like what Taconic is building, you're going to see firms not just growing here in the early phases like IndieBio, but instead of them leaving and going to one of the major hubs, they're going to be able to stay here in New York, which is really the key. A lot of great ideas are grown here, but then they move out to where the clusters are. And we really are at the tipping point where New York has now got enough real estate, and in line, there's going to be enough real estate for a lot of much larger firms to hang around. So it's a very exciting time.
It is very exciting. I know some of these costs are very capital intensive on the tax side. So some of these landlords may be able to benefit from some tax deductions if they choose to go that route. Can you also, I guess, discuss, maybe all of you can chime in on this, about the flexibility life science tenants need? It's my understanding they may start off, at Indie Labs, and they go from an incubator, and then they sign a big lease, and all of a sudden, they sign for 2 floors, and in a year they need 5 or 10 floors.
Yeah.
So I guess, Brooks, we could start with you, and then.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is one of those things that we think about all the time, and when we're working with developers. Especially like Taconic, and thinking, how do you make sure that you have enough room for growth? Because at the moment somebody gets their Series A funding, they're often off to the races. And if it really starts growing, they could go from 4 people to 40 to 400 before you know it. And you need to make sure that they have the place to grow, which is why these other clusters are growing so dramatically, because there's enough growth space for them. And I think that's going to be the thing that's going to make New York a little more attractive, is you have the ability to grow with what's happening, as Matt said, throughout the city, but also in the wings, being Jersey City as well as Long Island City.
Tariq, you want to?
I totally agree with the point that Brooks made, that as once you hit Series A, it's off to the races, and we see this all the time. But I will say that there is an element of risk between Series A and the startup, the setup of the startup. You still need a lot of equipment, and there's a high chance the startup won't make it to Series A, especially in the type of funding environment we're in. You can raise up to $3 million and sustain yourself for 4 years, and need bioreactors and need filtration systems, and need a clean facility and fume hoods, and the entire capex that's needed to get beyond benchtop scale, and still the startup might not proceed to the next stage. So I think working with startups still requires some element of risk. And how life sciences is different is it has to move fast, but you also have to be very patient, because it takes sometimes 13 years for the company to actually return a single dollar to their investors. So I think landlords and just real estate in general has to warm up to this risk, and that can present interesting challenges for the landlords and for the people that are zoning.
I'll just chime in.
Please.
One thing we believe is crucial, and I'm speaking for New York broadly as a hub, is line of sight. So startup companies, if they're deciding to come to, say, IndieBio New York, they really need to see line of sight into their growth. So can I grow within the incubator? At what point do I need to graduate out? Are there pre-built lab opportunities when I become a 15,000 square foot tenant with 40 employees? Is there then further growth opportunities when I raise a Series B or a late round, or God willing, go public, or see another big capital event? And so it's one of the things we're excited about, having our assets in the same cluster. We can provide that line of sight. We're also looking to build labs for sort of tenants along the spectrum. What IndieBio does is so important, not only from the space, but sort of some of the mentorship and other services provided for the sort of smallest end of the spectrum. We are then picking it up sort of after that stage, creating graduation labs, pre-built labs that are essentially plug and play, with opportunities for flexibility, not only within the space, but options, flexible lease terms for tenants to grow. And then with our latest development, the largest floor plate for lab buildings in New York, 54,000 square feet, I'm referring to 125 West End, the opportunity for big tenants to come in and really, in an environment with robust infrastructure, create their own flagship for whatever it is that they do, the type of research that they do. So line of sight and creating spaces that meet the challenges, as the other panelists refer to, for where the companies are in their stage of growth. It's very different from where they are. So we're seeking to provide flexible space solutions for tenants all along that spectrum.
Yeah, Matt, I'd also just say that, the pre-build piece is a huge part of getting New York up and running. Cities like Boston and San Francisco have a lot of older stock as people graduate to the newer buildings. We don't have that yet, and we're definitely seeing that as our trend in some of the buildings we're doing now. A big chunk of them are being pre-built, ready to go, and then flexible growth after that.
I guess speaking of some of those challenges, Matt, how are developers incorporating sustainability and energy efficiency into their commercial laboratories now?
Yeah, and I think there's a perception for assets like this. These are big power users, given as I referred to it earlier, the robust nature of the infrastructure. From air capacities, air change rates, fans, heating, cooling, etc. So it's a challenge because of the nature of the operation, that these are using a lot of infrastructure. That said, we've gone into and this is a statement that applies to all of, at least Taconic's projects, whether it be office or residential. Sustainability is top of mind whenever we're designing new systems. And in life science, it's a unique challenge, again, given the nature of the operation. So at the Hudson Research Center, we've installed air source heat pumps, special, the largest electrified plant to address sustainability, in particular, some of New York City's citywide initiatives around sustainability. So there's a number of factors, at 125 West End, new energy efficient curtain wall, et cetera. So we see that in a number of different respects. The engineering and the systems are probably the most impactful, again, given that these are high energy use facilities. But it is something that we're addressing in real time now in each of our projects, and we're excited to deliver not only great lab space, but some of the most energy efficient lab space, at least in New York City.
Yeah, and Matt, one of the interesting things that we've obviously been observing in Boston as well as here is the ability to prepare our buildings for even better energy efficiency using air source heat pumps. In 10 years are going to be much more efficient than the ones we have today, and it's going to even become a much more beneficial for the building's use. And I think the tighter envelope is key, because we were talking 6 to 8 air changes an hour for lab buildings. These are huge energy consumptions, and the more we can reclaim of that energy before it goes out of the building, obviously the less we have to use, the better we are for the environment. But it is fun because we're really being pushed to the limit on how good of a sustainability we can be for these buildings because they're such energy users.
Are you seeing any supply chain issues that are affecting the life science industry right now?
We definitely are. Many of our buildings we're having to do early release packages just to make sure, not even the cost issue, but just to make sure we have a piece of equipment on site on time, because speed to market is so important in this industry. And not having the air handlers or the steel or the curtain wall becomes a huge deal. So we're having to actually front load a lot of these projects. And I'm sure the next panel's also got some of those concerns that they'll be able to identify, but we're definitely ordering things way earlier than we ever have, just in order to make sure that they're there on time. And even it's not even a money issue at this point. It's making sure you have the delivery of the items.
Right.
Very good. Yeah.
Absolutely. And not just in terms of building out new spaces, but also downstream. So once a lab is set up and the startup is growing and science is moving along swimmingly, you need to get consumables. There's a lot of media you buy from firms like Thermo Fisher, from Sigma Aldrich, and these are really sophisticated, very, very expensive vials, sometimes going into the tens of thousands of dollars. They have to come refrigerated. They have to be CGMP compliant many times. And we're seeing that many of our startups arbitrage low rent in places like San Jose or somewhere in the middle or even upstate New York, and very quickly realize that a lot of their consumables take forever to ship. And they're also not they're not able to be compliant with all the manufacturing needs. So I think that's another dimension to it, where you decide to create a cluster has to be really well integrated to downstream supply chains, because there's just high R&D and really sophisticated products that go into delivering these products to market. And that's where we see a big bottleneck today. In fact, I'll go as far as to say that can be a crippling bottleneck for a lot of these ventures. And that's also where we're seeing a lot of picks and shovels startups coming along, just like it happened for data, where now you have entire startups like Snowflake that are doing entire infrastructure for managing data needs. So infrastructure for biotechnology in itself is going to become a huge business opportunity in the coming years, and we're making investments in that space. And we're hoping that there'll be more decentralized, not centralized systems, just like it happened for data centers in the case of IT, where data centers are distributed across space, and hoping that that's something that we see for this industry.
We have a few questions in the chat over here. I think this one, maybe Matt is best to answer. What are the opportunities for life science growth in New Jersey?
Well, I think, and Brooks alluded to this, New Jersey was home to big pharma for many, many years. There are significant assets already at play, significant biopharma campuses. There's been several in the news lately with consolidations and other changes where those campuses are now opportunities for whether it's a big firm or mixed uses of life science space to come in and redevelop. I think the most important factor is the workforce. New Jersey has a significant workforce trained in life science, so you have a talent pool there. As with all sort of New York, New Jersey connections, you've got mass transit to connect, whether it's folks commuting into the city or even reverse commutes, connecting sort of the different communities within New Jersey, New York, et cetera. But there's already assets existing in terms of lab space. There's talent, and I think as New York continues to grow, as Brooks mentioned, there are projects active in Jersey City, in addition to some of the suburban locations. So I think I think New York as a metro region has the opportunity to really grow, and that will include New Jersey, New York City, of course, and Brooks mentioned even Connecticut and some of the other areas. I think it's all about that workforce, that talent pool, and therefore you're able to see the whole region as a whole with growth opportunities.
Yeah, I would add to that, Matt. The Jersey City, we're doing 380,000 square feet there with Thor that'll be online in another 6 months, and we're doing campuses out there. So New Jersey has a great, as you say, a pool, but also it rounds out the New York metro area. And I think we just need to think about New York not as a state, but as an overall area, because that's really where we're going to be able to create our unique cluster with all of our different areas. Much like in Boston. Boston started with Cambridge, where we had done one of the early buildings, but now it's 10 or 15 different areas. We've got buildings going on throughout Boston. So you think about Boston now as the hub, not Cambridge. And I think that's the same thing that we're going to see from New York, slightly at a more accelerated pace.
And I think one area we're seeing it in particular where there's some real links is, with New York City being really a hub for innovation and seeing the talent pool and the research focused on sort of early stages of a variety of different verticals within life science. One area in particular is sort of the biomaterials. We heard about sort of the planetary health concept, so ag tech, climate tech. Mm-hmm. These are all really interesting verticals. And in the case of biomaterials, for example, you need a really diverse talent pool to create a company that's creating something that's used in fashion or in the food space or what have you. You're talking marketing talent, of course, the research talent and the production talent goes without saying. But what happens in sort of the real estate is you see a lot of that early stage lab work in New York City, maybe even some of the early prototyping in New York City. But now the question becomes scale up. Where are you going to manufacture this? And a lot of that, certainly in the early stages, it wants to be proximate to home base. And so New Jersey, upstate New York, these former industrial areas, that's a really interesting opportunity as sort of a second wave of growth as the New York cluster continues to strengthen for folks in those emerging sectors where some of the early work's happening in the lab. You move out, you talk about bioreactors and fermentation tanks and things like that. You start to move into some of the more industrial neighborhoods in Jersey, maybe even Long Island City and the like. But there's some real opportunities for those other communities to benefit from what's happening in some of the main urban clusters.
Right. If I can quickly add to that, there's a lot of universities that are now partnering with startups, and universities have huge facilities which they aim to commercialize as startup scale-up facilities. So one that comes to mind is Rutgers, and there's many like Rutgers throughout the East Coast. And these are engineering schools, really strong engineering schools, really established engineering schools, and engineering schools that have a lot of infrastructure set up. And we love when our startups partner with universities and can rent out capacity either at the university or at the outskirts of university. And these have launched some very big startups. One that comes to mind right away is Impossible Foods, that is making a plant-based burger that leads like a real burger. They commercialized their first line out of a manufacturing facility in at Rutgers, and Rutgers had a good kernel food scientist, and Rutgers had been studying this far before it was commercially viable, and so they even had the infrastructure. And I think co-locating with universities and expanding around the university area, if that can be done, is always we always welcome that, and hope to see that happen all over the country and the world.
Very exciting industry. I'm just looking at my the questions over here. Somebody has a hotel and they're interested to see if they could potentially turn their hotel into lab space. You know, somebody has a standard building and they want to know what are the requirements to convert that standard building into a life science building. Brooke, I don't know if you want to maybe give some general.
I'd just give you, we could give you some general outlines on that. We have a couple of cheat sheets that we work with just to kind of identify what's important, but there's some very simple things from the design considerations regarding what kind of science you're going to do in it. If it's going to need a lot of wet lab, you're going to need a lot more, quite different infrastructure. There's floor-to-floor heights that give you more flexibility than less, but as I said, in some areas we can do it, but you really want to make sure that the numbers pan out. Some buildings are never set up for it. You need 100 to 150 pounds per square foot to have the flexibility to move lab equipment around. You need a lot of room on the roof. If you're going to be putting the equipment on the roof, there are opportunities to use up floor area for it, but that becomes kind of a numbers game. You're using up floor area for something that you could be doing. But it's really and each building has its own characteristics, and I think it's something that we study each time. And I'm sure most of the realtors on this panel as well have looked into going. You have to go and see each building. But if you'd like, we can always, if anybody wants, just reach out to me and I'll send you some of our checklist items if you'd like.
Unfortunately, it looks like we're out of time. This has been a great discussion. Thank you all for joining me, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks for having us.
Take care, guys.
Okay, so now we're moving on to a panel discussion about making room for the life science market, understanding the full life science ecosystem. And we've got a stellar set of panelists to talk about these topics. They are just follow on very well from the conversation that was just had with our first panel. So if I could ask each one of you to introduce yourselves just briefly and the organization that you're from, starting with Daniel, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to, thank you. I'm Dan Durazi. I'm the Executive Vice President and Head of Acquisitions for Breakthrough Properties. Breakthrough is a real estate investment and development firm fully focused on the life science sector, and I lead our investment strategy and execution across all our markets. So thank you for having me.
Great. Glenys?
Hi, I'm Glenys Mera. I'm the Director of Biolabs at NYU Langone, located in Soho, New York. Biolabs is a chain or network of biotech incubators located throughout the country and now also in Europe. And at the NYU Langone site, we have about 30 companies that are incubating in our 50,000 square foot space. We provide pretty much all of the capital intensive resources for companies that are going through their seed and Series A stages of development. And luckily, we have great success in helping companies scale from 2 to 3 members all the way to 40. And I think recent successes include Imuni that have managed to raise quite well. I think the last one was 200 million. So we do help nascent biotech scale quite rapidly. and we focus on that cohort of companies that are pretty much in the therapeutic and also precision fermentation space.
Terrific. Peter?
Peter Schubert, NEAD Architects. We've been working with the institutional life science across the country, including Stanford, University of Oregon, a number of institutions in Texas. But recently we've been working on life science throughout New York City. We're excited to say that we're working on the Blood Center on the Upper East Side, Center East. Nancy and I both participated in Alexandria. We're also working on a new project together called The Cove, which will be a really transformational community in New Jersey. And we're also working through Boston and Philadelphia.
Great. Jonathan?
Jonathan Schifrin, Senior Vice President, CBRE Life Sciences Practice Group. I'm part of the Advisory and Transactions Group within CBRE. We've really been working specifically in New York, but also across the country with landlords and tenants. My practice is specifically on the agency side with landlords, but we help advise them on conversions and leasing of their projects to life science ecosystems.
Great. So let's start at the 10,000 foot level before we drill down to what individual companies need in terms of thinking about the ecosystems in hubs across the country. So why are innovation hubs and campuses in such high demand for life science and tech companies these days? Daniel, you've got developments across the country. Do you want to address that?
Kick off. Yeah, I think one really unique aspect of the life science sector is that companies actually prefer to cluster around each other in these activated multi-tenant campus environments. And they're typically anchored near these key research institutions in any given market that are generating all this talent, IP, and innovation. You know, we've seen this clustering effect take fold over numerous markets today in the US. Think about the cluster that's formed around MIT and Harvard and Boston, around UC San Diego, literally surrounding the campus in San Diego, and this triangle that's formed between UCSF, Berkeley, and Stanford in the Bay Area. And it's really become this, essential ingredient for some of these emerging markets that are looking to create these sustainable life science ecosystems. And from my perspective, one of the main reasons that clusters are so attractive and important to companies is that they bring together this diverse mix of users, right? You have big pharma, you have established biotechs, you have startups, and then you also have that full support system that frankly these companies rely on, including a variety of service providers, partnerships, VC funds, real estate providers, et cetera. And the last thing I would just add is, being located in an established ecosystem, it really helps foster this natural level of interaction between these innovative companies that spurs collaboration. And from what we've seen, biotech leaders really value the qualitative benefits of being co-located around other exciting, technologies and companies.
Yeah, and that's true not just in a hub or a campus location, but Peter, Center East is really going to be a building, right? And you're building that same kind of ecosystem in Center East.
Absolutely. I mean, New York has some of the finest life science institutions in the country. Center East will be in the heart of it. It's really all about, and it'll be an exciting because the Blood Center will be part of it, but also the be partners, as they call them, in the industry, pharma partners that will also join them in their research. And I think what Daniel was talking about is really exciting because really creating an ecosystem is really about shared interests and really creating that sort of synergy among the various tenants as well as some of the major tenants is going to be very exciting there.
So what are the challenges in creating an environment like that within a vertical laboratory?
Well, the challenge is really, I think New York is unique in the sense that you can do chem throughout the building. In most cities, chem disappears a little bit as you get to the top of the building with its constraints. The exciting thing in New York is that you can go very high with your buildings and really create a vertical campus. Floor-to-floor and connections are essential. Amenities really can be throughout the building in a very positive way. I think one of the things that's really going to be interesting about Center East is really some of the conferencing center that's going to be at the terrace level, access to outside, which is going to be essential going forward. The ground floor will have kind of a community aspect to it with multi-purpose rooms, exhibition, and some critical sort of front of the house sort of space for the blood center to really do community outreach.
So Jonathan, there's been a lot of focus, especially in Washington these days with the Build Back Better program and other federal programs that might be coming down the line on kind of spreading the wealth in terms of making sure that communities, which may not be the front line life science clusters in the country, also have the opportunity to be developing these kind of tech and life science ecosystems. So what are some of the key ingredients that emerging markets need to develop in order to get in the game here?
I think it definitely goes without saying for any of these emerging markets that you need, high concentration of skilled labor. You also need good academic healthcare institutional partners. Really without those kind of ingredients, it's difficult to make progress as an emerging market. Unless that market is more kind of on the manufacturing side where you don't necessarily need that scientific labor. All of the research has been conducted in another market, it's been exported, and now, we're just kind of manufacturing it. But I would say, those two are kind of top of the list. The third one, for me is just the existence of built lab space. And I think we've seen that certainly in New York, Philadelphia, where we're working right now, Chicago, some of these other markets, that are kind of outside of the top 10 or have been traditionally outside of the top 10. Really, for me, the single biggest limiting factor for any of the emerging markets is that built lab space. There's such a high upfront cost for companies to put the infrastructure into buildings, create lab environments for themselves. And typically when they go and raise early rounds of funding, that funding is geared towards, their scientists, they're hiring, they're trying to ramp up. They've got a couple of years, kind of foresight of where they're going to spend their capital. They don't typically want to put that into a building that might not necessarily be theirs in 2, 3, 5, 7 years. So, having kind of all of those elements, having some landlords that have the wherewithal, the ability to put the capital into buildings is critical.
I think those are all great points. I would just add one or two. I think John hit on the main ones that I would list too, but one other that I would add is just the access to capital, and in particular, access to risk capital. So really having a strong VC community that's active is critical to letting some of these companies really grow and expand. And then one other element, the talent, John touched on the talent. Talent is critical, and it's really becoming a bottleneck a little bit for growth in companies. But in addition, I think the markets that have the potential to recruit executive level talent, because as these companies grow, we see a real need for executive level business leaders. And some of these metros that have the ability to attract that, high quality of life and executive talent really help the cluster flourish.
Yeah, the venture point is an important one, right? Because especially in communities like Boston and Cambridge, venture capitalists don't like to travel. So they tend to invest in companies which are nearby where they can really partner with them. So that's a key element. Jonathan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to jump on to Dan's point. He's totally right about the executive level talent. One of the things just specifically in New York that we've talked about for so long is the connection to New Jersey and all of the kind of traditional pharma talent that resides over in New Jersey. I think it's definitely one of the elements that's allowed New York to take off over the last 10 years.
Mm. Yeah, and it's in terms of thinking about pre-built space, it's not just the MEP systems and the backup power and making sure you've got dedicated shipping, right? The space needs to be flexible and adaptable and ready for reuse as the science changes. Does someone want to address that?
Yeah,
well, I think is some. Please go ahead, Glenn.
No, I think adaptability is key because, as we know, the technology life cycle is ever evolving. What was in vogue just 20 years ago becomes, just old news very quickly. And so as the the knowledge in that's the foundational for life science actually changes and evolves, so does the technology. We see just on our site, the requirement for instrumentation is evolving quite rapidly. So just the power requirements, the space requirements for certain equipment changes and evolves rapidly. And just the way the workflow flows around these equipments is ever evolving. So adaptability, I think, is absolutely key here.
Yeah, so you work with many of the startups that, you know, landlords and developers would love to attract to their buildings or developments and help grow. Can you talk a little bit about the life cycle of a startup like that? And you mentioned Immuni, you know, they came from a small company at Biolabs to, you know, a company that's just moved out and has outgrown their space already, right? So can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think it goes hand in hand with the risk capital that's going into these companies. So quite often companies join our community after they've successfully raised their seed round, usually 2 or 3 founders, maybe 2 founders, one team member, and they are just trying to get to their next milestones to raise additional capital. So the hurdles that the companies in our community are experiencing are largely technical. They're executing their experiments to fulfill proof of concept, to advance their development efforts, potentially getting closer to the IND milestones that's needed to raise additional capital. And that's what's absolutely unique, because it is a capital intensive endeavor. These companies cannot grow their teams, cannot scale without actually fulfilling the promise of their value proposition. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that they have the resources, systems, operationally, what's needed to execute efficiently. And I think in terms of the standard pattern that we're seeing is companies start very small, 2 to 3, they raise their seeds, they get to about 10, 15 people, they're going through their Series A, and they're actually graduating post Series A, in the case of Immuni, right before their most recent Series B. And it's amazing that they started with 2 or 3 people, and by the time they graduated, there were 130.
Wow. That's a sharp growth curve, right?
Yeah. And it's not just them. So we have other companies, for example, Black Diamond, that actually was a public company, but had a very small footprint, scaled tremendously as well. And we have others on the horizon. So it's going to be interesting to see. We also have a few companies that are intentionally keeping a relatively small footprint, and they're not part of the larger story, but with computation now being very much in vogue in the development, a lot of things that used to be done in lab can now be done in silico. And so we see some companies staying small and farming out most of their research to CROs. But they do need some lab footprint. So they're never going to scale most likely to a 20, 30,000 square foot space, but they will likely need maybe 500 or 1,000. And so I think there is a great opportunity there as well. And in terms of flex space, I think having flex space that can accommodate such companies is going to be important in the future, because we're seeing more and more of these companies, and they're joining our community.
Yeah. Peter, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Sure. I think, I just wanted to redirect it perhaps towards the adaptability. We're seeing in a lot of the ground up, particularly, it used to be a kind of a 60-40 split in favor of 60 office, 40 lab. And I think, love to hear Danielle and Jonathan's position, but I think we're seeing it go to more like 60 lab, 40 office. And that kind of fungibility really does allow for the growth within the building for the companies to expand. Most importantly, it really does become it's really all about flexibility. And I think as companies do perhaps address hybrid, that's another reason why they're going to basically a more lab-centric program. It allows particularly the labs. Nobody has a lab at their home particularly. So, really that's going to be really all about labs that can be used part-time or in a sense in a hybrid fashion. Even more than that, I think the labs in the sort of urban areas and that sort of 15-minute walking community near research, near culture, near all sorts of amenities are going to be more and more important to the sort of new recruiting aspects of labs and lab buildings.
That really speaks to urbanism in a post-COVID world, right? I mean, scientists are in their labs. They need to be there. They need to be able to get to them and live nearby.
Absolutely. And I think, particularly the COVID that we're working on, Nancy, is going to be a really great transformational project for that, because it's basically about a 3 million square foot, half lab, half residential development. It'll have state-of-the-art sort of technology as well as sustainability. We're using something called aquathermy, which we're going to be able to get pretty close to carbon neutral on the project, so that in fact, through this aquathermy technology, which is basically using wastewater in the same way you use geotherm, we're going to be able to get to a method where we can actually produce more energy via that than both the residential and the lab will need. So, again, I think as we look at the larger scale projects and as communities are embracing the labs like the New York area, those larger scale projects will become possible, and that really we can really push technology forward on every front of basically life science.
Yeah, so that brings up, the kind of innovation continuum and what we're doing at the Cove with not only technological innovation and economic growth, but environmental sustainability and design for innovation, which is really important. So programming plays a huge role in creating place, whether it's a building or whether it's, a hub like the Cove. So I would, Jonathan and Daniel, you have something, to offer there in terms of the types of programming that you're seeing?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I would just say, going back to Peter's point, that and kind of tying it back to the talent, it is a war for talent in the biotech industry today. And we're seeing more and more companies placing an emphasis on creating these activated, amenitized environments as a tool for recruitment and retaining top talent. So whether it's programming, amenities, we're seeing the increased emphasis on creating, placemaking to really create the best workplace environment for these top scientists for recruitment and retainment of talent.
Yeah, placemaking is really, really important here.
Yeah, I would jump in also, though. There's a lot of different life science buildings, that exist certainly in our area. I don't think all of them are going to have this kind of placemaking element as the New York City life science market has evolved. There are some buildings that are just smaller in scale that don't necessarily have the ability to provide the size spaces that, Nancy, I think you're talking about with the Cove, and Matt Weir was on the previous panel. We're working on 125 West End Avenue. We're going to have a sizable conferencing center down on the ground floor that I think is, kind of what you're speaking to with a large kind of auditorium. But it's interesting because New York is such a unique market compared to some of the others across the country, where everybody can kind of get, to every building in a relatively short amount of time. So I think the connectivity, rather than having kind of a micro cluster, almost Kendall Square type area in New York, the need for that is less here, than it is in some other markets.
Yeah, 125 West End Highway is a really interesting example of the kind of amenities and programming that can be put in a single building. And it's not just the conference center on the ground floor, but they have a rooftop area for gathering. They have kind of the DNA spiral that goes up the center of the building, which provides that ambiance and, the ability for people to bump into each other as they're going back and forth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the building, it really is designed, I think, with a scale that we only have in a couple of other buildings in the city. You can do those things when you have that scale, 400,000 square feet, 54,000 square foot floor plates. So, the ability to put an incubator on a floor, some graduation suites on a floor. You've got the roof deck, this amenity space helix, DNA helix that goes up to the building, goes up to the roof of the building. That goes back to the early days of the building as a Chrysler Corporation showroom where they used to drive cars up to the top. and then again, the conferencing facility, it's all going to create kind of an ecosystem within a building that isn't necessarily possible in some of the other smaller assets that exist in New York. But it's also going to allow for companies to scale over the various life cycles, of the firm, which is, something pretty unique in the city, as opposed to a landlord, let's say, just delivering smaller suites and then having those companies, need to jump out, move to another building as they grow.
Yeah.
Jonathan, if I may, Nancy, I like where Jonathan's going, because I think New York is really poised particularly to do two things. One, we've got a number of life sciences emerging that are going to be state of the art. They're going to be major buildings. But we also have just an incredible ecosystem throughout the building. I mean, West End is on the large side. Center East is on the large side. The Cove will certainly be on the large side. But a lot of the projects throughout New York really rely on the existing sort of fabric of the city, the live, work, play environment, as we frequently call it. And there, the real plus in New York is that you can take and reposition buildings and really find yourself in an amenity-rich environment. It's not that the buildings are without amenities. They actually have one of the most amazing sort of urban sort of live, work, play environments in the world at their disposal to call the amenity package. And I think a lot of the developments we're seeing throughout the country that are about innovation, not necessarily life side innovation, but innovation, are really looking towards making space, office space, or innovation space adjacent to an amenity-rich environment that they can really rely on as their amenity package.
Glennis, what kinds of programming are most attractive to your tenants?
The programming that involves a lot of mingling and networking, and we've tried to create that organically. So we've created spaces that are a bit more inviting. Our cafe is where people from different teams, sometimes even competing teams, meet, exchange ideas, troubleshoot. As mentioned, the endeavor in our community is a technical one. And so exchanging information, exchanging ideas, know-how, et cetera, is incredibly valuable. And creating opportunities for those relationships to be made is absolutely vital for our community. In terms of the more formal traditional programming, we have a De-risking Biotech series that's specifically geared towards companies that are in the valley of death, where you're trying to translate innovation from academia to clinical phase, and all the various ways of approaching the hurdles that most founders don't consider. They don't consider, okay, well, what's an alternative to the traditional VC route of capital raise? What are the alternatives and creative ways of structuring the entities? And some people assume that once you create a company, there's no going back. You can't really restructure. And we're trying to debunk quite a bit of myth around that, and helping our community and primarily our founders think about things in different ways to de-risk their endeavor.
Yeah, so another important component of this is helping to actually educate the founders of these companies about, a lot of them are scientists. They haven't had a lot of experience with growing companies before. So educating them about commercializing their technology, about how to grow their companies, about the kinds of partners that they need. So it's not just an education about the real estate, it's also an education about, business and how to grow one.
Yeah, absolutely. And networking with the appropriate business entities. So meeting accountants and lawyers and people in this very robust New York ecosystem that you normally wouldn't meet. As we know, connections are one of those things that you never know when you're going to leverage these relationships. And so we definitely encourage attending these programming sessions as much as possible and meeting as many people as possible, because that Rolodex becomes vital, especially in later stages of development.
Yeah. Daniel, what kind of programming? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I was just going to, we're talking about ecosystem. I just think that this is a really important point, because when we started in New York, there were very few VCs that were here. There were very few attorneys that had experience in the life science space. There were very few architects, engineers that had the knowledge and the wherewithal. And most of that stuff was imported from Boston or from the West Coast. So Nancy mentioned kind of educating on the real estate, in addition to real estate professionals like myself having to work and educate, groups that were coming out of biolabs. There was a real lack of that other part of the kind of ecosystem, that would allow a company to be really successful, because it's not just, a scientist has a good idea, like Glennis was saying, you hit that kind of valley of death if you don't have the right space, if you don't have the right team around you, if you don't have the right project management team to actually get your space built out properly to then be able to move into, your company might not exist in a couple of years. So, all of those different kind of elements of the ecosystem now exist in New York, which I think is helping accelerate the growth here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Spot on. That's spot on. And it's John, you literally took the words out of my mouth. But one thing I just want to add to that is that doesn't happen overnight, right? And I think John spoke about how the ecosystem has developed in New York, and New York, has a lot of these unique ingredients. A lot of metro areas are looking at how can we create an ecosystem, but it takes time and it takes commitment and it takes resources. And you really need all of these elements, because there's so many ways you can hit a wall, whether it's the physical infrastructure, the access to capital, the access to talent. So, we've seen New York really transform over the last 10 years, but a lot of metro areas are looking at how can I replicate what Boston, San Francisco, and San Diego have done, and it takes time.
Yeah. So what does Breakthrough Properties do to encourage the ecosystems in the areas where, they have developments or buildings that they're working with?
Yeah, I think it's a number of factors, and I think it's unique to every market and what that specific market needs. Obviously, we're just one element of what the ecosystem needs, but from a physical perspective, we're trying to deliver spaces that I think this panel has spoken to. So it's high quality, flexible, reusable spaces that are amenitized, that are located in areas that are proximate to the existing cluster, right? And provide the connectivity that Glennis spoke to, provide the transit access that John spoke to, provide the amenity base that Peter spoke to. So I think that's, something that we do from a physical perspective. And then we're also trying to help increase those connection points, right? It's really important. So any ways that we can support our tenant base to create those natural interactions of the network that's critical to them. So whether it's introducing them to capital, to other innovators in their space, mentorship, advisory, support service providers, architects, GCs, things of that nature. We all can help create the ecosystem just from the networking effect, which is really quite powerful.
I think, Nancy, that speaks to, we do a lot of mixed use. And one of the things that I think is very clear as we get more and more into life science is that the developers really become genuine partners with the tenants, and really how that they basically reach out, how they engage diversity programs, how they engage educational programs, community programs, really is something that I think is now emerging in New York in a very positive way. And clearly this group is on top of it.
Yeah, so that brings up an additional point, which we haven't discussed yet, which is hasn't necessarily been front and center in past conversations, but is becoming increasingly important, and that is social equity in terms of workforce development, training people to be able to get these good paying jobs in this industry, reaching out to community organizations to engage them, not only in training, but also in job placement. Does anybody want to comment on that? Because social equity is becoming an increasingly important component of the ecosystem. I know, Peter, we had NYC Builds Bio participated with the Blood Center to highlight the continuum of community organizations that they were working with and actively, training people in the neighborhoods for jobs of the future. And I think a lot of the academic institutions and developers, and certainly the public entities that are giving incentives in this space, are thinking about that.
Yeah, certainly. On the Blood Center, for instance, Longfellow and the Blood Center partnered in really putting together a great program for education and outreach into the various institutions, CUNY, and some of the neighborhood educational programs that are going to make that a real center of education and science and innovation. Nancy and I wrote an article called Beaker to Broadway, which actually places a lot of kind of emphasis on really making life science, particularly in the urban areas, much more of kind of almost a cultural center than it is necessarily a very introspective innovation center. why not take the opportunity to do community outreach through exhibitions, through programs that really are all about sharing what's happening inside the building with the surrounding community. This can be done, I think, as life science moves forward. We like to say that life science is the sort of new artist community of the future, in the sense that they're all about abstraction, innovation, and creativity. And I think we can kind of reformat how we think of these institutions, particularly in urban neighborhoods.
Yeah, by expanding kind of the cultural attractions that are inherent in the programming, either in a building or in a hub like the Cove, you can draw, additional people into the conversation and onto the campuses.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, as this group knows well, West End and through a lot of breakthroughs in Glennis's work, really, I mean, I think that there's two fronts, right? When you go into a community, you have to sort of develop the program in order to get community engagement, but it's also the opportunity to make it a center of interest for sort of the greater community. And I think one is under pressure and the other one is really an opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's tremendous potential. I think the COVID pandemic has actually brought about an opportunity in this area to have discourse. Suddenly biotech is front and center. It's impacting everyone's lives. It's impacting children and individuals that ordinarily don't think about biotech, don't think about the ramifications and the power of it. And so we plan in 2022 to leverage that and move into high schools. And from my perspective, I think it has to start much earlier. The inclusive aspect has to start high school, middle school, because we do have growing representation in the graduate school, postdoctoral level, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And it starts with getting people self-motivated and interested in this area of life science and the endeavor to improve life. And I don't think it's been something that people could personally connect to easily in the past. And the COVID pandemic provides an opportunity for that.
Yeah, that's a great
also think
point.
there's another element of this. If you go back 15 years ago, 20 years ago, a lot of science, a lot of commercialized science, came out of kind of pharma campuses. People that went to school for science and technology that wound up in kind of the life science field, only had kind of a few paths. I think the kind of commercialization of medicine today is kind of providing a different pathway, for a lot of people, which is attractive, when you have kind of the VC funding and everything, that you're seeing kind of participating in the growth of the ecosystem. So I do think you're going to wind up getting, a lot more people participating in the life science industry now. It's just become more kind of economically viable.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of really interesting examples on both of those comments. One is Opentrons here in New York City, which has $1 billion valuation now, was started by a young man out of GenSpace, which is a community laboratory, and he was in NYU's design program with no scientific training before that at all. Now they're building instrumentation for automation in the laboratory. And at the Cove, Jersey City and the Liberty Science Center, which is right next door, are partnering to create a K-12 STEM school so that the people who are living and working in that area will be able to send their kids to a school where they will be trained in tech and life science right from the beginning. And so starting that interest at the early ages, I think, really democratizes the process and allows more people to participate.
Yeah. I think also the scope of life science and biotech has changed tremendously for the past few decades. Before it was associated with therapeutics and the creation of medicine. Now it's becoming more of a model that chemistry had in the last century, where biotech is creating new materials. It's creating new alternative ways of solving everyday problems. So anyone can biohack as long as you have a lab. you need a lab to biohack, but it's easier than coding, and you get results quite rapidly. In fact, the companies that scale the fastest in our community are the ones doing biohacking precision fermentation. So we've got C16 that Jonathan's group has worked with extensively, moving into the West Side Project. They make synthetic palm oil, and they've gone in 2 years from an idea to a product. And it's tremendous. And that doesn't happen in the therapeutic space. It happens in these biosynthetic precision fermentation space. And so I think we'll see a lot more of that coming online. And the hurdles for that are not as extensive as the therapeutic ones.
Yeah, that's a great point. Science has become so much more diverse in the last 20 years, mainly because of technological change. Daniel,
yeah, I was just going to say, we're really seeing a blurring of lines between biotech and tech in general. You know, we're seeing things like big data, artificial intelligence, robotics, cell and gene therapies all entering the lab for the first time. And it's creating a number of new exciting avenues for innovative, technologies and therapies to treat and potentially cure some of these chronic maladies. So I think that, the integration and the blurring of the lines between tech and biotech has also, created a lot of new exciting opportunities. And I think we're really just scratching the surface. We believe we're in the early innings of, some really exciting advancements in biotech that are shifting away from treatment to curing disease, which is obviously very exciting.
Yeah, I think it just highlights the importance of not pigeonholing life science into therapeutics. It's really a continuum, right? Where you start with research in the academic lab if you're working on therapeutics, but it goes all the way to, as you said, bioinformatics, data storage, artificial intelligence, digital health on the tech side, and everywhere in between, which goes to, new applications for food, energy, materials, you name it. The prior panel was talking about fashion. I think in 50 years, every product we use will have a biological component, which is really exciting. Any final comments?
I would say it's very important, and I sound like a broken record about this, that we all build the pipeline of small startups that are entering the ecosystem. I think that's vital for all the conversations we're having. We want to set up systems where people can succeed fast, but also fail fast if something's not working. I think developing pathways and systems to identify those projects and those companies that are not going to succeed is very important. And the other thing that I think is absolutely crucial is, as we're thinking about space and we're thinking about expansion, is to consider this continuum of biotech. So for example, manufacturing, we can now actually have potentially manufacturing in these vertical lab communities that traditionally didn't exist for small molecules.
Yeah.
And so I think just keeping this future in mind is going to be incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Just, I wanted to reinforce that. I think, again, the great thing about urban areas, particularly New York, is the diversity of different spaces to be in. We have the repositioned buildings. We also have easy access to manufacturing. And we also are enjoying now a new generation of really state-of-the-art buildings. So we have the full range that's necessary. In addition to that, I love what Daniel was saying. Was really all about we're starting to see a synergy between the tech and life sciences. And as you start to really imagine that, New York is really well positioned. Obviously, areas of California are relative to really integrating tech with life science. And I think that that's going to be a game changer for those two communities.
I would just highlight something that you touched on earlier, Nancy, and kind of to end with for me, is that scientific research can't be done from home. It can't be done from the local Starbucks. These companies need to be in front of their benches to advance their science. And back to the topic of this panel, having these full service activated ecosystems are extremely important to allowing these companies to make the groundbreaking research that they're working on. So all of us doing our part to create these activated and full service ecosystems, I think, are critical to the sector.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Jonathan, any last comments?
Yeah, I think just to kind of, tie it all together, I mean, Clemens, hit on the point. We want to kind of future-proof the ecosystem in New York. I think groups like Breakthrough, some of the other landlords that we work with are working on doing that, providing kind of the scalability of the ecosystem, to allow companies to grow and remain here. That's just going to become critical. It was critical on the smaller side. I think that we've solved that in New York, with some of the early stage spaces, the step out spaces, the graduation spaces, and now it's just kind of incumbent upon the landlords and the other stakeholders to try and deliver the larger projects, like the Cove going forward.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time today. This has been a great discussion about the importance and necessity of an ecosystem and not just a development in a building. So appreciate your time and thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you to our second panel. That was a terrific conversation. Next, I'm going to be taking over here. We're going to be talking about how the life sciences market has been an important investment safe haven, but it's also a whole new world or unfamiliar terrain for leading investors and developers. So we're going to talk about how this is all playing out with this whole new world. I've got with me there are two great experts here for our fireside chat. We have Zach Holderman with CBRE, Senior Vice President, and William Hunter, co-founder and principal of Outshine Properties. So just want to welcome you guys, and maybe let's start with Bill. Can you tell us just a bit about yourself and about Outshine Properties?
Sure, Greg. Thanks for the opportunity to join. Outshine Properties is a real estate investment firm that focuses on life sciences real estate, in particular adaptive reuse conversions throughout the United States, with a particular focus on the northern mid-Atlantic, San Francisco, and a few points in between, including Boulder, Colorado, and a couple different points as well. As far as my background, I was one of the initial people hired at Biomed Realty Trust. While at Biomed, I ran acquisitions and leasing for Biomed. Spent a lot of time in Boston, northern mid-Atlantic, as well as San Francisco, in particular the East Bay. And then I matriculated to Wexford Science and Technology, worked in the eds and med sector, developing university research parks, in particular in Miami and Norfolk, Virginia. Really gained a lot of knowledge and expertise there. And, I found myself with my partner, Jonathan Scheinberg, and I launched Outshine about a year ago. So collectively, we have over 35 years of experience in the vertical. And in particular, we really focus on delivering speculative lab suites within all of our adaptive reuse conversions.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Holderman, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do with CBRE?
Sure. Thanks for having me as well. And this is Zach Holderman, Senior Vice President with CBRE. I'm sure everyone knows CBRE, full service real estate company. My responsibilities over here are sourcing debt and equity for life science projects nationally. I co-head with my partner, Sabrina Solomiani, in Atlanta, but really been doing this for about 20 years by virtue of just landing in San Diego. And before it was popular, we were knocking these lab deals through and through, and Bill and I were catching up earlier. And we turns out we worked on a project on the late, I guess, mid 2000s. So small world as it is, but it's a great space to be in, a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That was the Center for Life Sciences, that first 1,000 square foot project back in 2004, 2005. So yeah, that's awesome. We've got some old ties here. So, we've talked about, and we know the primary markets of Boston and San Diego and others, but money is coming in and looking for places to go, and we kind of want to. And I want to start talking about the activity that you guys are seeing in the secondary or tertiary markets, kind of what's leading to that and what those places need. So, Bill, can you kind of start talking about just sort of the different markets and landscapes that you're finding new interest and what that means?
Sure. And thanks, Greg. I mean, Zach is a consummate expert in this vertical as well, somewhat from a different, angle, which is he's connecting people and with capital. Being a full service operator at Outshine Properties, we do focus the obvious three markets everybody knows. You're looking at Boston, San Francisco, San Diego. I mean, those are white hot markets. They always have been. They always will be. Other markets when Zach and I first started, and we talked about this yesterday and this morning a little bit, is there were really 7 primary markets, and the markets, in addition to those 3 kind of superstar markets, you also had the traditional pharmaceutical, that small molecule corridor in the Mid-Atlantic, which encompassed essentially New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and in particular in there, Einstein's Alley, Route 1, in that central northern Jersey area, Bridgewater, New Jersey, et cetera. And then in Philadelphia, the 202 corridor, that is home to a tremendous amount of pharma manufacturing based on the highly qualified workforce. And then when you continue to slide down the coast between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., the I-270 corridor has traditionally been a very, very active market fueled by big pharma, big bio, and the government as well. Going out to the West Coast, you obviously San Francisco, San Diego are great. The emerging markets at Outshine, we do focus on the primary markets, but we focus on the secondary markets within those primary markets. So in Boston, that would be the 128 corridor or the Mass Turnpike corridor. We just closed a 500,000 square foot transaction 2 weeks ago in Framingham, Massachusetts, and the activity's been through the roof. So those are highly sought after markets, as well as the urban cores have really been so built up. The opportunities really reside for Outshine, and I think a lot of groups, is in that what has become a secondary market, being that northern Mid-Atlantic, New York, New Jersey, Philly, DC, but also in addition to San Francisco and San Diego, you've got Salt Lake City, Utah, you've got Phoenix, Arizona, Houston. I mean, Houston's not a secondary market by any means, but it's an emerging third party ownership model lab market. And then obviously I touched on Boulder in the 36 corridor between Denver and Boulder, and then even smaller markets that have tremendous research, human capital, and investments. And those are markets like Cleveland, Ohio, with the Cleveland Clinic, and Case Western Reserve University, as well as Minneapolis, home to Medtronic. So that's really an overview from a national perspective of the markets that I see as white hot, secondary, and even tertiary. And I would love to hear Zach's thoughts on that as well.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of what's been talked about today is easily echoed, and I'd say we focus on fundamentals, right? When you have a market like Denver was mentioned earlier, where you have 1.5 million square feet of demand and 600,000 square feet under construction, and rents that are hard to find. Candidly, one of the big problems we have in our industry is just data points, relative to qualifying transactions, repositions, or development. But the fundamentals are all there, and you have these STEM grads that are being pumped out, which is fundamental to these small companies that are large companies that are raising tremendous amounts of money through various sources. It's really just focusing on where there's opportunity, and everyone's busy in those primary markets. As Bill mentioned, we pay attention to the South Bay Peninsula in San Francisco, for example, which has grown exponentially in the last 5 years. It wasn't even part of the discussion. San Mateo's, some of these San Carlos markets are now just absolutely crushing it. And the reality is it's all demand driven, and it's fueled by that capital. And so we're doing a lot of work right now in several of those markets, paying particular attention to the top 12 clusters that produce 98% of the specialty life science PhDs in the country. So you have the key researchers, and to grow a PhD, it's a 10-year process. It's a whole hell of a lot shorter for a mortgage banker, but trying to get these personnel into these positions it's becoming a very spotlight topic of conversation thematically for us.
It's funny, Zach. The time that it takes to grow a PhD is about the same time it takes to bring a product to market, right? A pharmaceutical product to market. It's about 10 or 12 years between the IND through commercialization if everything goes right. So I've never made that connection before, but that's a great connection, making a PhD and a pharmaceutical product.
So Zach, you're kind of talking about, or sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's you can't ignore the fact that there's more liquidity in the market from a debt and equity perspective, and similar to the dearth of personnel to perform science, there's a dearth of qualified operators, owners, developers across the country, and candidly, a lot of those folks have married up with equity capital in particular. But every portfolio manager, chief lending officer, everyone wants in their portfolio now, and they're no longer grouping it into office, which Bill, remember happened, call it 5, 6, 7 years ago. We were screaming from the rooftops to get a loan that would be 100 basis points premium to the lender. Today, it's 100 basis points premium to the borrower. So it's a tremendous environment to be transacting in, and we're seeing we're tracking 24 million square feet of construction reposition activity across the country, and it's really the audience has grown by a multiple, which is fun for us for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Zach. Is that the industry, there's always concerns about, is there too much product coming online? Is there enough demand to outstrip the supply and keep the market dynamic correct and ripe for investment? I look at it, and my partner Jonathan looks at it as the only constraints at the moment are really qualified individuals from a development and finance perspective to actually effectuate the amount of lab space that needs to be developed in those core, secondary, tertiary markets. That's really those are really some of the pain points that we're experiencing now. And everybody's looking to rush into the space. Very few have done it for an extended period of time, have learned the ups and downs of the industry. When we deliver speculative lab suites, I delivered my first spec suites 20 years ago for Biomed in Malvern, Pennsylvania, in the Route 202 corridor. And that was when the market was really dominated by small molecule chemistry research. Biotech was certainly a thing, but it was less popular. And the spec suites that we're going to be delivering in Framingham, Massachusetts, and soon to be in New Jersey and Philadelphia as well, they're wildly different. They might not look wildly different to the untrained eye, but the dynamics within the laboratory market have changed really towards a large molecule and biology intensive, much less chemically intensive. So it's really been an evolution over the last 20 years. And those of us who like you, Zach, like Jonathan Schifrin, who was on the prior panel, those of us who have lived that for 2 decades, there's a clear advantage, and there's a learning curve. It's a high barrier to entry that can really only be really taken down with seasoned professionals. We're fortunate to have a great bit in San Francisco, San Diego, and Boston. It's the other markets that I think can use some help, and people like Zach and myself. That's what we do.
For sure. So there's actually kind of 2 parts with that in terms of getting the right personnel, not just having the talent to fill these spaces, which Zach we've talked about, but one of the biggest challenges to growth in these markets is the holdback of institutional information available for these investors. Can you guys kind of talk about just how that's sort of the largest barrier here to just getting people to know what's going on and the right way to move forward?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick this off. And look, I have the great fortune of being associated with CB, who's a great producer of research information. But Bill and I were talking about this as well. It's if you're interested in multifamily and you go into a market, you could probably find 10 white papers and construction costs, rents, vacancy rates, and you can become pretty wise on the product type pretty quickly. Relative to other product verticals, we're a fraction of the inventory, and there's not a lot of attention. And quite candidly, there's a lot of protection over the information. And so, our access, for example, to end market professionals who are transacting on those leases, who are filling those buildings, or working with those tenants in the market it's a tremendous tremendous benefit to being in a large institution like this. We produce reports quarterly, annually in market, but it's very difficult. And what the problem with again, half a decade ago, marketing these loans, for example, you were really only really focused in those primary markets where you could find data points, because your tenants didn't have credit, right? You didn't have all of those elements that a lender is going to look for to protect their position in a non-recourse loan. So getting into these secondary markets and being able to say, hey, look, there's again, harkening back to the Denver Boulder market, you've got a multiple of demand relative to what's coming online. Rent data points are limited, but when there's demand and these tenants really thinking about their ledger, rent, it falls pretty darn low on their order of operations relative to personnel and materials. So for the prospects of inching up a $45 or a $35 rent triple net to levels that we're seeing in San Diego, which are approaching 75, it's a pretty easy case to make, but absent data points, it's very difficult. So there's inbound calls weekly from equity sources, both foreign and domestic, educating debt capital providers perpetually. It's really just kind of giving them data points and looks at opportunities in order to have them appear on the next marketing list and hopefully deepen that bench of the competitive environment for capital. And Bill, I know, maintains his own data set relative to educating folks within a market. So,
just to build on what Zach's saying, at Outshine, we source equity and debt on every single deal. Yes, we have some pre-qualified partners, but we look to place the equity and debt on each deal that's most advantageous for terms, based on geography, based on the opportunity, be it pure lab or development, which would be more into the GMP world. Which again, having we did at Biomed, we did the largest sale leaseback of a GMP facility in Rockville, Maryland, 20 years ago. It was a $400 million deal. Like I said, I think it was 19 years ago, with Human Genome Sciences. And what happens is it's incumbent upon us to educate the investor stack, and that's in the equity market, that's in the debt market. Yes, like Zach will do a great job, and we've used CB, and they're incredible at marketing that the opportunities. However, when you're outside of the big three, it's still considered pioneering in many ways, and that pioneering creates quite a heavy lift for me. I'll just selfishly speak about Outshine. It's a heavy lift to educate the investors on the market, educate them on the life sciences market within the market, the historical data that otherwise is readily available for office, industrial, and multifamily is not available for life sciences. So, investors want to understand what the lease comps are, what the sales comps are, what the tenant in the market list looks like, what the pent up aggregate demand is, and outside of Boston, San Fran, and San Diego, it's tough to get to. It's tough to get to that information. So people like me, we end up keeping our own organically produced Tim's report, our own organically produced lease comps and sales comps, and they're even limited at that. But as far as supply and demand, logistics, and dynamics, there are most of the I would say most, if not all, of the top markets at the moment, as we sit here, December 2nd, 21, have zero availability. Boston, San Diego, San Francisco, Philadelphia 202, DC 270 corridor, there's no availability. So to consider these pioneering markets is a head scratcher to me. When Zach and I first started, like I said, there were 7 primary markets, but it really is. It's a difficult task to do that education. We're making tremendous strides in it, and it gets easier and easier on a weekly basis. But understanding the really where where the money can be made, yes, in the cores, you can look at a deal and you're going to find a 4.5 cap these days. That cap compression has been tremendous. From when I first started, we were looking at 12 and 13 caps up and down the East Coast. Now in the cores, you're, like I said, you're at mid 4s, 5 at best. But in those secondary markets, tertiary markets, we're looking at a 300 to 400 basis point split on premium. And that's where I see the investment over the next 5 years being, having opportunity for all of us.
Okay, for sure. Well, I feel like we could talk about this for quite a while, but we have to start to kind of wrap up. We do have a good question here from our audience, and it kind of touches on what we've talked about. Have you seen, or do you see the possibility of venture capital money looking to invest in life science companies in opportunity zones? So that's one side. And then if you could just very kind of briefly kind of describe sort of the venture capital, market side in terms of life sciences and what you guys are seeing. Zach, can you take that one?
Sure, I'm happy to. It's not a common topic of discussion relative to opportunity zones. I think there's a different motivation for an opportunity zone transaction. Obviously, it's so if it works, it's an adder to it. But I think these funding sources are more interested in the efficacy of a drug, right, as a profit generator than they are, a tax vehicle. So it hasn't really come up into my purview, and it may, but it's really not a part of the topic of conversation relative to VC funding. I mean, you can look at the statistics that we put out a report yesterday that you can access the website and or reach out, and happy to provide. But quarter over quarter, we continue to raise more money, and whether it's NIH, VC collaborations, the funding vehicles for these companies, both small and large, is and seemingly no immediate end in sight, is what's fueling this growth and this demand. And so the pandemic has been mentioned a couple of times on the previous panel, so I don't need to beat a dead horse, but you've got an environment where it's just there's so much room for growth in the immediate. And as Bill mentioned, if you start to think about market fundamentals, yes, it's $1,000 a foot type exposure, but when you start to compress cap rates a couple hundred basis points over a handful of years and rents grow up 15-20%, there's a lot of profitability, a lot of margin in that.
Yeah, and just to echo Zach's points, as far as opportunity zones, every local government agency wants to promote their tax credits for hiring and things, and that all makes a difference. More so in the GMP side, when you're going to hire 125 people for a 400,000 square foot facility, yeah, that can make a difference. Endo Pharmaceuticals was courted and successfully brought up to New Jersey. I think it was last year or the year before, with a $40 million incentive. The vast majority of the companies, however, that we're putting into leases for anywhere from, call it 5,000 to 100,000 square feet, are typically pre-revenue, and a lot of the incentives from the local government don't make a big difference because they're not there. It's not a car manufacturing or a battery manufacturing plant bringing thousands of jobs and pure revenue. It's just really, it's not been a huge factor. So I would say opportunity zones are great, but they don't really drive a lot of the deals. And as far as the funding, it's a very unique market, and I think Nancy touched on this in the previous panel. But life science really transcends all aspects of life, and the funding is unique in that, yes, there's VC funding and there are unicorn valuations, and so that's a big component of the funding. Another part of the funding, though, is sponsored research with big pharma and big bio, and they look at their pipeline rather than developing their own pipeline through pure R&D. They look to acquire their pipeline of drugs, and in doing so, fund a lot of these biotech and pharma, mid-stage or graduate companies, as Jonathan Schifrin said before. And as they scale up, their investments not only come from VC, but the sponsored research as well as government funding. And the great part about government funding is it's non-dilutive financing. Mostly, and the government's not taking warrants in these companies. They're actually investing in these companies to advance a product or a therapeutic category for a specific reason. And there's a lot of examples of companies that have purely relied on government funding in the hundreds of millions of dollars to expand their product line and develop their particular therapeutics. So it's a unique model. It gives developers keeps them up at night a little bit because of the lack of credit on a lot of these tenants. But if you follow the dynamics of the market for the last 25 years, as a idol of mine and a mentor, Alan Gold, these companies follow a very similar pattern. They lease space, they either make it or they don't. They fail fast. When they fail, they exit and vacate the space. And the space becomes actually more valuable because of timing and because of the improvements that are there. So as a landlord, you're investing far less money in second and third and fourth generation space, and you're filling that space up faster. And those, that dynamic within the financing works all day long. And that's really the origin of this industry.
All right, for
Yeah,
sure.
it's a great point. I mean, you've got a situation where your tenants co-investing a tremendous amount of capital into their space. And not that you ever want them to fail, but that there's real dollars being spent and invested in that space that is reusable by and large if it's done right, ultimately.
Okay, for sure. Well, look, guys, this has been really great. We of course went over our time because we could talk about this forever. But thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for the conversation. Zach Holderman, CBRE, William Hunter, Outshine Properties. Thank you guys both so much. I have to pass it off now to co-deputy editor of Commercial Observer, Tom Acatelli. Tom?
Hi, thanks, Greg. I want to ask our panel, Colleen, Clay, and David, if you could just quickly introduce yourselves, and then we'll dive into the topic. Colleen?
Perfect. I'll start out. Hi, everybody. I'm Colleen O'Connor with Biomed Realty. I am our Vice President of Leasing, covering our East Coast and UK markets across our platform. Biomed's focused on life science and technology real estate. We've got about just shy of 14 million square feet across all the core markets. In my region specifically, our East Coast and UK, which is about 6 million or so square feet.
David?
Hi, good afternoon. David Christensen. I lead our life sciences project management at CBRE, specializing in laboratory and cGMP build-out. I work with companies that are in the startup phase through global organizations, and our offices are nationwide, primarily in the large, life science sectors, from Boston to Tri-State, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and San Diego. Great to be here.
Great. And Clay?
Yeah, hi there. It doesn't seem like my video is working. Can you see me, Tom?
No, but we can hear you just fine.
Okay. Well, as long as you can hear me. So yeah, Clay McPhail with Argent Ventures. We are a real estate investment and development firm headquartered in New York. And I have been involved for the past several years in one of our large redevelopments in Jersey City, which is a mixed-use life science and residential development of about 3 million square feet, and have been active in trying to pull that together and everything that you need to do to make a successful life science cluster work in a new, kind of emerging market like that.
Okay, thank you. The sort of meta theme of this particular panel is helping companies break into the space and find out what they need. So I wanted to start off with the question, how do you help a company break into the life sciences space? How do you help them determine what kind of space they will need, including over time as their need evolves, or as their needs change? Who wants to go first? David? Or Colleen? Go ahead. Colleen.
Go ahead,
Oh, no,
Colleen.
I can take it from just thinking about it from Biomed Realty's perspective, owning real estate and interacting with the tenant base. I think, what we see from the tenants differs very much depending on the type of user that you're working with. So what a startup company that just has a couple scientists is looking for, it's very, very different from what a larger pharma type company is looking for, which is also very different from what a academic type of research institution may be looking for. So I think the very first thing is really understanding the type of tenant user that is looking for the space, because ultimately that's going to drive the programming and the type of facility that user base will need. I think if you're thinking about some of the smaller groups, a group that is really just starting out with just a couple of scientists, most of those users really benefit the most by going to more of an incubator facility where there's a lot of shared services, just because it takes a lot of time to actually get set up in a lab facility, and there's a lot of expertise that's needed on the environmental health and safety front. So for those groups to get started, it's really more beneficial for them to go into an incubator stage. And then we often see groups that graduate from that type of a model into their own space. Some of the growing venture capital backed groups, as an example, users that may need their own space, but they don't necessarily have a real estate department or somebody that's tasked with facilities at their organization. And in those instances, on the ownership side, we really try to take the pen and design the space on their behalf and try to generate something that we think is generic and something that they can use, versus having them run the design process where it may be their first real estate facility that they're actually leasing. And so it's not necessarily an area of expertise. And oftentimes you find those types of users really just want to get in and start performing the science and not necessarily interested in designing real estate space, which is very, very vastly different from what you would see with a big pharma operator who typically really wants to drive the process more sophisticated. They've got in-house real estate professionals that are working on these types of projects day in and day out. And in those instances, at least from the ownership side, it's really a partnership where we're working with them in parallel to design best-in-class facilities. So what each group's going to want is very, very different. I'm sure David can kind of give us some guidance working on the CBRE side and partnering with some of these groups as they run through their projects.
Yeah, thank you, Colleen. It's very apparent just by what you just said. We work in very, very similar situations, and I couldn't have answered it much better than what you just did. Similarly, a company just starting out, I agree wholeheartedly in the incubation space. I think of a couple spaces that are in the Princeton market in New York City, where they start, and from there, graduating into whether it's a 10,000 square foot space, 20,000 square feet or larger, what I typically do is meet with that company and really try to understand the science. What are we doing in this lab? Is it small molecule, large molecule, mRNA, cell and gene therapy? What do we need in that lab space? What science are we trying to conduct? What are the objectives? And then also trying to understand the growth rate of the company. Are we really just shifting a half dozen scientists to a lab space, or because we have Series A funding or we have Series B, and we see our growth projections going from 10 to 60 in the next 12 months, it's going to be a much different space. So really starting with the science. What are we doing in that lab space, and what are the growth projections is where we start. And then we start looking at other things within that graduate space of like amenities, as we talked about earlier in the discussion here today. But that's really where we start. We use a tool that helps build out that space based on those items I just talked about, with the head count, the type of science, because then the type of science will then result into the equipment that's needed in that lab space. So we'll start laying out the equipment, and with those multipliers, we kind of get to a square footage that then our brokers can go out into the market space, see what's available in the market space, in the buildings that serve life science best. And we start developing test fits from that point. And then we move into that next stage with the lease negotiation. So that's kind of where we start off. So I'll turn it over to Clay if he has any other insights he wants to add.
I mean, I think you guys covered that pretty well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's much more I can add on that.
Right. Along these lines, what do you tell companies to look for when they're looking for space? I mean, besides growth, like what makes a good, I know this is open up a lot. This is a sort of a topic within a topic, but
yeah.
What makes for a good life sciences site, a good life sciences location, whatever the size of the company?
Yeah, we think about this all the time on the biomed side, because naturally we're, especially with the current state of the market and the way some other industries are performing, we've had a number of opportunities that have come across our desks in terms of, somebody has a building that's vacant and they call you and they say, well, can't we just make this a life science facility? And we always, before we even start to dig into any of the infrastructure for a building, the very, very first thing that we look at is really the macro environment. Ultimately, where these life science companies want to be located is where they can hire their talent base. They need to be in the lab doing work, and in order to do that, they need to be able to hire the talent base. And the best and the brightest talent is going to be what drives them to that next research milestone. And so that's really the number one thing that these companies care about when they're looking for a location. And so even if you've got an excellent facility, if it's not in a location where you can drive and retain talent, it's really not useful to anybody. And we often find that the CEOs of these companies, the real estate cost in terms of their overall cost and decision-making criteria is actually very low on the list. And they're willing to pay a premium to be in areas where they can hire that best and brightest talent. So the very first thing we're looking at is really macro trends in terms of what life science companies are already located in a cluster, where are the academic institutions that are graduating these PhDs and the talent that's actually needed to do the research in the labs. Is there a government support for life science? Is there government funding that's flowing into the life science sector in a particular region? And along those lines, is the particular region supportive of lab facilities? Is it an area where if you've got a building, you've got to do a change of use? Is it going to get through the process easier, or is it going to take you a very long time to do it? So those are some of the factors that we think about from a larger perspective. And on our biomed side, our model has always been to focus on clusters. So really, Cambridge, Boston, obviously being the probably the most advanced cluster now, but regions like San Francisco that folks talked about a bit earlier, San Diego, we believe very much in Seattle, and we've got a pretty strong presence over in Cambridge, UK, that we're growing pretty rapidly. And then, you have kind of the core of each of those markets, and then you have submarkets that are developing around them. Especially you think about a Cambridge, Boston region, you're running at near 0% vacancy for all of those spaces. And so naturally, the market has grown outside of just the core Cambridge, Boston, and you see really excellent life science locations in places like Waltham, Watertown, Lexington, Bedford, kind of that surrounding area. And then obviously you've got ancillary uses like biomanufacturing that are going a little bit further outside of the core, but all kind of part of that critical ecosystem.
Clay, you can speak in particular to ground up development, correct?
Yeah. And I just reiterating on what Colleen was saying, and I can't speak to every market because we're pretty, we're kind of laser focused on New York, New Jersey metro market. But the biggest driver that we've seen, when we talk to both large and small companies, life science and pharma, is access to the employment and labor base. And partly, one of the issues that's really, I think, hamstrung New Jersey is the fact that the inventory is not necessarily where the labor base is, or where the labor base wants to be. So we've got a lot of exurban, kind kind of older legacy campuses that make up a majority of the square footage. And then you've got new product in New York that's coming online, or some new stuff. But there seems to be a mismatch between where the labor pool is and where the product is. So I mean, that was kind of one of our overall thesis when we were putting together the project is, Jersey City's kind of that area in between, where you can kind of get the labor, and the product in an urban location where it doesn't exist right now. But the other thing that I think is key is a location where there's good science happening and trying to kind of curate that. If you're building something from nothing, which, in a setting where you're in a market that's not as developed, you have to make sure either you're positioned next to a research campus or a research institute where there's already good science happening, or you're going to have to bring that in bring in a consortium of schools to kind of curate that and kind of nurture that and grow it. And that's going to be key to making sure that you're able to attract other companies to that center, and to make it there. When we started talking to big pharma, I mean, they were interested in the idea of, Jersey City. Yeah, that makes sense, right? It's it's urban. You've got access to your senior level scientists. You might want to live in the suburbs. You've got you're close to New York, so employment base, and the transportation options are all great. Everything great makes sense. But we want to make sure there's good science there before we're moving there. We don't want to go into in a vacuum or into a void, right? So you have to kind of create that, do that placemaking initially, and that's kind of where the value is.
Clay, can you describe, you talked about the project, just very quick for the audience. Can you describe what you're talking about in Jersey?
Yeah, so we're, it's about 4 or 5 city blocks, about 3 million square feet in total, half life science and half residential, with Pocket Park in the middle of it. We've been working on it for several years. We completed the assemblage and remediation, dealing with all of the initial pre-development, and are working on, at this point, bringing in our academic partners to get that rolling, and have been in talks with several universities. But we're right in kind of the edge of downtown Jersey City, right next to Liberty State Park. We think it's a good location. You've got live, work, play. You've got the park right there. You've got access to Jersey City right at your doorstep. Jersey City and New York City right at your doorstep. So that's the 30-second elevator pitch.
Okay. Well, a viewer wants to know what the name of the building is and the address.
It's the name of the development is called The Cove.
Okay.
It doesn't really have an address, but it's basically it's off of Jersey Avenue, if anybody knows Jersey City, near Liberty State Park.
Okay. And that reminds me, if any audience members do have questions, drop them in the Q&A. David, do you want to tackle that? What makes a good development site and what makes for a successful project?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing to add on to what Clay and Colleen were saying about what we look for in real estate. Just real quick, because it's important to also know the culture of the company. So when we're out, I mentioned about the science before. So if we're doing a lot of chemistry, understanding the logistics in and out of the building, especially if it's a higher rise type building. The culture of the company is super important because, there's some really nice ground up buildings in New York City, whether it be Alexandria or Deerfield or whomever, have really nice products, but some companies really like to have their own entryway, or like to have their own lobby and seating area, or need a lot of conference room spaces, or want a more open lab and maybe a perimeter seating arrangement inside the lab. So understanding the culture of the company, and I think both Clay and Colleen also mentioned the proximity to where folks live, think about Einstein Alley or Bridgewater at the Center of Excellence, where there is a lot of people that live that are in this industry that like to have that more commutable location. So I just wanted to add to that again, is with the science and with the culture of the company. Now you mentioned development site. I know Clay can certainly, and Colleen can knock this one out of the park, but a couple projects that I'm working on right now, what has been paramount in it being successful is helping when we're working with developers to find dirt, is understanding the zoning of that area and that location. The zoning of that space is super, super critical as far as timing goes, and the possibility of even getting that project off the ground, and then also the traffic pattern and the traffic of that area, egress, ingress to that location is another one that helps make that really successful. And I'll get into a couple other items in a moment about what makes a successful project, but I wanted to let either Colleen or Clay tackle the development site piece.
Colleen, I think we did touch on it. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I mean, just to echo David's point, the zoning is one of the very, very, very first things that we look at. Obviously, time is money, right? So if you've got to go through a process to change zoning, you're incurring both time and risk. So that's probably one of the very first things that we look at before we'll even really dig in on any of the other elements of the site.
Clay?
Yeah, and I would also say that I think it's maybe there are places out there, but I think most municipalities, if you were going to rezone to add in a life science or lab use to bring in these companies and to bring this kind of commercial development into municipality, it's generally not a super heavy lift, but like Colleen was saying, it's definitely something that you need to understand what you're getting into as far as what's allowed and not allowed. And there's a lot of nuances in some of how local zoning codes are written when it comes to lab use, because a lot of them may not, they were written, some of them 20 or 30 years ago, right? Or longer. Right, so some of what we're doing now, like some of the, biomanufacturing, was it manufacturing? Is it lab? Is it, you get into these discussions, is it education because there's an academic university here, or is it, so there's some of that gets a little complicated and you can get kind of stuck in the muck there. But I think if you kind of pull back big picture, most places want this to happen. So, a lot of municipalities are going to work with you to make sure that that's clarified. But the other, big thing is obviously traffic. And if you're not in a transit oriented location, that's definitely going to be, one of the other issues, like it is with any development, right? I mean, anywhere, anything you're doing.
David, you had mentioned a couple other points as far as sites. Determining successful site.
Well, I think, just rolling into what makes a successful project is working with people that have the life science experience, whether it's the brokerage team or the project management team. I find that hiring, a design team that they might be really good at designing industrial space or office space, but when it comes to life sciences, it's a much different animal. So having an A team designer, same thing with the construction management team. We spend a lot of time at CBRE vetting the design teams, the general contractors, CMs in this industry. And then it also comes down to the individuals that are available for the project, from those design teams, from the CMs, and also the other specialty consultants that would be involved in a life science project. Another aspect is, a lot of, I think Colleen even mentioned it earlier, folks that are coming out of that incubation space into a new environment may not have ever been through this process before. So really holding their hand to help provide them the information so they can make decisions, and then trying to find somebody on the client side that once they have that information, can make quick decisions is certainly useful as well.
I wanted to ask, it's touched on, a reader asked about a possible hotel conversion. A reader, I keep saying reader, viewer. There's a lot of, the pandemic rendered a lot of space empty or unused for a long period of time. And, there's a lot of talk of conversion still, of conversion of office space, hotels. Given what we've already discussed, that space doesn't necessarily lend itself to life sciences. It's not a matter of, you have to have all sorts of other conditions in place, correct?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few factors. The first one is, like a hotel's a good example, right? Right. Maybe right now the hotel's not being occupied, but in the long run, hopefully, I think we all hope this is to be the case, that some of these regions where these hotels are, that at some point in time, we're going to be back in a place where they're at occupancy. I think too, even if the hotel may not necessarily be performing so well financially, a particular community may not necessarily want to give up hotel, a hotel zoning use. And so moving something out of a hotel zoning use to allow for a life science facility could be pretty problematic, especially in an urban environment where city planners are really cognizant of a diversity of uses. That's not going to be the case in all regions, but that's definitely one of the main considerations you have to think of. And then, assuming you had confidence on an ability to change use and you thought the location worked from a life science perspective because the talent base is there and all those other macro factors we talked about prior, then you've kind of got to dig into the bones of the building and see if from an infrastructure perspective, it would actually work. And in an urban environment, it's particularly challenging because, you're working, one of the most important things for life science users is adequate access to loading, which is obviously hard to add into a building in an urban environment when you're working across busy streets. Things like floor load capacities, floor to floor heights for a building, electrical capacity, all of those things that I'm sure David can speak to as well, and Clay as well. But all of those things, some of them you can solve with money, some of them you can't solve with money. Some of it just you're dealing with an existing structure and it kind of is what it is. There's also some complexities about building life science facilities in a high-rise location. Working with a hotel that's got obviously a high-rise hotel, you may have some problems on the upper levels of that location. So it's actually a lot more challenging than people think it is to convert. We go through an inventory every quarter, kind of looking at office vacancies and just vacancies generally across the market. And once you kind of actually go through building by building and find the ones that have enough vacancy to make it worth it, and you look at the zoning and you look at all these other problematic elements, especially in an urban environment, the list of actual conversion candidates becomes very, very small. The other thing that's really complicated is if you have a building that's partially occupied, it can be incredibly challenging to convert it because you're working around tenant spaces. You may have to build additional shaft spaces. You may have to build loading capacity that didn't exist. And all of those things can be very challenging to do if you have tenants in a building.
Clay or David?
Yeah, I mean, I would say from a conversion standpoint, most of what we've seen is it's as expensive or more expensive to convert a lot of properties than it is just to build ground up. I mean, there are exceptions to that. But yeah, you want a building that has massive floor plates with high ceiling heights, generally, not too high overall. Because like in certain states and municipalities, and New Jersey is one of them, you have restrictions on how high up in the building you can put chemical storage. Yep. So like if you're doing a lot of heavy chem, you can't do it above like the third or fourth floor anyways. So, not to say that you can't have other uses for that space, but it does hurt your marketability in some markets, given, some of the fire code issues and other things. So there's a lot that goes into it. But I would say 19 times out of 20, a conversion play doesn't really pencil out so well. But every once in a while, there's a diamond out there that might work.
Yeah, I'll add to that in that I agree with what Clay just said. A lot of times they're cost prohibitive, but the starting point is super important. I know in our database, we've looked at dozens, if not hundreds, of these opportunities nationwide. So we have a lot of information on what a really good starting point looks like and what the costs would be to convert a hotel to lab use, converting an office space to lab use. We've looked at shopping centers. We've looked at Sears for manufacturing. We've looked at all types of spaces all over. So, shoot me a message if there's something that you're looking at, an asset that you think might be convertible. In Einstein Alley, for instance, they've been really successful. Converting all that industrial space into pretty much all lab over there and some manufacturing space back there. So that was a good starting point that was able to eventually, nowadays it's just about 90% lab space in there. So that was a good situation. So there are some one-offs, one out of 20 that do work out.
I wanted to also talk about this is the meta theme of this panel is about breaking in to the space. So might generally focus on smaller companies or startups. How does the co-working or flex space model fit into this? We don't need a lot of space for a long time.
Yeah, I think we see that component of the ecosystem overall is particularly critical, especially in markets like Cambridge and Boston, where you're running at 0% vacancy rates.
Right.
And naturally, the larger users are gobbling up a significant amount of space. And so having that innovation part and having a facility where somebody with 2 or 3 scientists can go to perform that critical research, that really innovative cutting edge research is critical to creating an ecosystem where new companies are able to enter the market and actually grow within the market. It is a more challenging model. The way that we do it on the biomed side is we partner up with operators that actually go ahead and have expertise in this and run those facilities. So, Cambridge Biolabs is a good example of one that we're partnered up with locally. But, essentially, it's the user base going in there is not going to have their own environmental health and safety employees. They're not going to have their own RA permit. And they're not going to be running a lot of these shared services for the facility. So it's really critical for the facility to be an environment where a scientist can truly go in and just start doing the science and not have to worry about regulations and permits and all these other things that can be incredibly time consuming. Naturally, users will pay a premium to be in those spaces because you have the flexibility of not having a lot of those overhead costs, and you have the flexibility on potentially taking a space for 6 months or a year before you can grow and get into your own facility. But it is a very critical part of the ecosystem, and one that, to be candid, in Cambridge, Boston, we've had a challenge making sure that we're accommodating enough of those facilities because they are really critical to the ecosystem. And naturally, when you have a lot of larger users gobbling up space in a 0% vacancy environment, it's hard to make sure you're keeping that diversity of uses.
I want to ask, is the idea that the space can be turned over quickly? Is that built into the model at all? Like, if it's not every startup is going to grow and be necessarily be successful. So is that built into the idea of this sort of smart lab idea?
Yeah, I think, if you were to walk through one of these facilities, you'll see, you've got kind of your standard lab benching, you've got sinks, you've got cold rooms, and you've got tissue culture rooms and all that type of stuff. So generally speaking, the majority of these users can work within the same space. And, the operators that have really excelled at this have come up with generic models where they can fit a variety of users in the space. That's not to say that these types of facilities can accommodate every use. They certainly can. There's specialized facilities for example, if you had a small biomanufacturing function that you needed to run, you probably can't do that in most traditional incubator spaces.
Right.
But for the most part, the spaces are really thoughtfully designed with the intent of being able to kind of plug and play users into a space within a fairly short period of time.
Mhm.
We have one question. We have to, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time left. This has been a great panel. We have one question from our audience. What is your best advice for a design firm looking to break into the life sciences industry?
I'll tackle that one.
It's a tough one. I don't know.
Well, first and foremost, I would hire somebody that has this skill set, that has experience in life sciences, right? So somebody that has a proven track record of designing laboratories, or a proven track record of designing, CGMP space, and start working with a project manager like CBRE, or with a brokerage firm, or helping Colleen or Clay out if it's on test fits, and just trying to work with a company that is constantly involved in this sector, and be delivering that value to us, because there's and again, I'm just speaking to a company that has zero life science experience, right? So it's hiring that person or that team eventually that has that experience, and then you start, you get an opportunity to design a project, you knock it out of the park, you start building a resume of that type of work. So that's, the value for me often is in the test fit side. It's in the preliminary designs. It's helping that company figure out that space that they need to get into when they're graduating, per se, out of their incubation space. That's one suggestion.
Oh,
Yeah,
Colleen, go ahead, Colleen. Go ahead.
I was going to say, on the landlord side, if you think about life science investment, it is more expensive if you're building out from shell space to build out a lab facility. And so one of the areas that we on the ownership side are particularly sensitive to is making sure a space is designed correctly. We always say internally, the worst thing you can do with a shell space is allow a designer to run rampant and design something that might be too custom and doesn't have a lot of residual value for the next user, because the way the whole economic model works for lab is you put in this larger capital investment up front, but ideally on this, when you're going to release that to a new user, you're not spending another $250 a square foot. The numbers would never pencil if that was the model. You're spending sometimes $0 a square foot, and hopefully no more than like $25 or $30 a square foot to release it to the next user. So if you have a designer sometimes that does something too custom or doesn't take into account where lab and office zones are really best suited, not only for that first tenancy, but for a situation where you might have to multi-tenant down the line if market dynamics change, it's really particularly critical on the lab front to be super cautious on that piece, because if you do design a space wrong, it will come back to bite the landlord. It'll cost them money, and then they're probably not going to want to work with you again. So that would be my advice, just thinking of it from the ownership side.
That's good advice.
We have another question from the audience. Same advice for a contractor, how to break in, especially in some of the larger markets. I guess the advice would be similar.
So I get a lot of call. Well, I'll tackle this initially, because I do get a lot of calls on this one. So there's a handful of companies that already do this really well, that have been building in the life science industry for a very long time, and then there's other companies that have not been doing it. So the advice that I get for them again is to, one, you need to get versed on the intricacies of building a lab, building a CGMP space, and it's helpful to have somebody on your team that's actually done this work. Hire that talent. And similarly with the test fits, I'm often in need to help Colleen or Clay and other developers with budgets. So getting those budgets early on that then can convert into a project is a way to get involved early in the process and delivers value to all of us the three of us collectively, and also gives you some insights on the intricacies of the space. So that's one way, is that, help early on with the budgeting, because it gets really difficult. We develop for our clients, selection criteria when we make a recommendation to hire a general contractor or CM. And it's often, the top of the list is often the team experience, the company experience of life sciences, the company experience and the complexity of a given project, their resume in the region, the quality control program in life sciences. So, looking at what that selection criteria is to be hired is good to know, but hiring that the people that have this experience already, the professionals that have this experience, and then helping us three with budgeting and constructability analysis. Look at the supply chain today, right? Helping provide some advice on lead times when it comes to HVAC equipment, interlock door controls, things of that nature. That all brings a lot of value to us, just trying to understand and pinpoint the timing of projects for clients as well.
We do have to wrap it up. Colleen, David, and Clay, thanks very much. I'm going to turn it now back over to my colleague, Greg.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Tom. That was another great panel. So that's it for today, unfortunately, but we'd like to thank all of you for joining in, and a special thank you to our speakers and sponsors for delivering these timely insights. I'd like to thank today's program sponsors once again. A special thank you to today's presenting sponsor, CBRE, and today's program sponsors, Anid, Ewing Cole, LK Partners Incorporated, and New Grange Construction, Marks Beneath, SGA. I would also like to thank our association partner, NYC Builds BioPlus. Thank you so much again, and have a great afternoon.